Assalamualaikum, welcome to a brand new video. My name is Arfan and thank you for joining me once again. In today's video, I'd like to talk about the Greco-Roman world. The Greco-Roman world is the world in which Jesus and his disciples were living in about 2 millenniums ago. And I'll focus mostly on the first century instead of having to narrate you the entire history ever since the conquest of Alexander of Macedon, also known as Alexander the Great. And so the Greco-Roman world, as we all know, the Romans overtake the Greek. You can call it the Greek. And ever since then, a lot of this Greek religion and you can call it theology even were incorporated into the Roman world itself. And so basically the Romans absorbed the Greek culture and the world of their gods, their divine realm and things like that, and so they made it their own. So that is why the term Greco-Roman world is used, because pretty much it is an extension of the Greek culture and societies and religion into the Roman era, if you can call it that. And Jesus from Nazareth in Upper Galilee was born, according to majority of the consensus out there, by the turn of the first century of the Common Era, and he probably ascended up to heavens, according to scholars as well, sometime around the date 30 to 35 of the Common Era as well. And so during these 30 to 35 years of his ministry, pretty much he secluded himself to within Galilee and Jerusalem. We have no reports whatsoever that is authentic, obviously, that Jesus actually went out into the Greco-Roman surroundings and preached there. In fact, Matthew even narrate to us that Jesus prohibit his disciples to go out into the land of the Gentiles. Okay, and whenever they pass through a town and then that town doesn't want to listen to their message, they should wipe off the dust of their feet. Okay, and so it basically symbolizes that Jesus and the disciples doesn't want to have anything to do with those people, and those people will be damned or be condemned to damnation, to the purgatory, and things like that. And so Jesus's ministry is focused around Galilee, and this is actually very, very important for us to know. The bigger context or the bigger world surrounding Jesus and his disciples were that of the Greco-Roman world. But Jesus has nothing to do with the Greco-Roman world. This is something that we should always pay attention to. We should take note of this, because the New Testament have been read by later church fathers as well as early patristic apostolic fathers. By the way, the term apostolic fathers basically symbolizes that there is an apostolic connection, and patristic fathers refers to like later church fathers, if you want to call it that way, that has nothing to do, like there's no isnad, like there's no connection. At least this is according to Christian tradition, for example. And so when I use the term apostolic fathers, I'm basically referring to like within the first century mostly, although it can be later, like in early second century as well, but mostly first century and to the mid second century, because there are some church fathers that have been, according to Christian tradition, have been taught by the apostles themselves, though a lot of scholars of early Christianity actually rejected this, and because there is basically no evidence to support this. But on the other hand, on the other side of the spectrum, a lot of these church theologian of the modern era, they claim that there must be some sort of an apostolic tradition being passed down, and more like an isnat in a sense, but when it comes to like passing down the teachings to the disciples. But then again, I believe that there's no evidence as well, and so if there's no evidence, then we shouldn't assume something, because if we assume it doesn't really mean that it is actually correct. But anyway, I digress. So returning back to our topic at hand, the bigger world that surrounded Jesus and his disciples were that of the Greco-Roman world, but Jesus has nothing to do with the Greco-Roman world. And so the New Testament have been read and interpreted in light of the Greco-Roman world. Now, within the Greco-Roman world itself, we have the diaspora Jews, and a lot of these Jews have been Hellenized, no doubt, and a lot of works have been written extensively, and we have a lot of evidence for this. And also we can refer to the New Testament if we approach it from one kind of reading, whereby the Corinthians and the Thessalonians were more of a Jews that have been teaching the Corinthians and the Thessalonians, but then when Paul came, he preached something else, at least to the Corinthians, because Thessalonians seems like a very new church. But there are some arguments out there that suggest or implies that Thessalonians have been taught by diaspora Jews with regards to Judaism, but then Paul came and then produces a different teaching. This is just a minority opinion, but we can really say that the super apostles as well, and this is also relevant to the epistles of John, the Johannine epistles, because we can see that there are some commotions between the church, especially in Johannine community. It seems to me that there's a conflict between the teachings of the Johannine church as well as the teachings of like Judaism and things like that. And also we can find this in Corinthians as well, whereby Paul came to preach a different kind of religion, and then it is rejected by some of the Corinthians, and they caused a lot of commotions and things like that. And Paul heard about this, and so he wrote letters to the Second Corinthians, especially chapter 10 to 13, the angry letter, you want to call it that. And so Jesus, he probably have nothing to do with the Greco-Roman world. His ministries were around Galilee, Capernaum, and Jerusalem. Jerusalem cannot be considered as his ministry if we use Mark, but if we use John, there has been a back and forth between Jerusalem and Galilee, and Capernaum as well. Especially in Luke as well, the very early portions of Luke, it seems to be that the people in the synagogue were expecting Jesus to produce some miracles like he did in Capernaum. But ironically, the Gospels have not even portrayed Jesus as having been in Capernaum yet. And so again, there's an explanation to this, and I've made a video about this, about the literary seams and how Luke edited Mark and things like that. So I do not need to get into this discussion today right now. But it seems to me that despite all of these activities and ministries that Jesus had, the New Testament doesn't seem to indicate anywhere that Jesus were involved in the Greco-Roman world, or that his teachings were based on the Greco-Roman context. And so the New Testament have been interpreted in a different sense than what Jesus actually was preaching about, because in ancient Palestine, in ancient Galilee, and at Capernaum and Nazareth, these were towns that doesn't receive a lot of tourists. Like there's no reason for any Greeks or Romans to go to Capernaum, for example, because these were fishing village, and it is like going to a rural and remote place in for example, in like Egypt, for example, and that is not explored by tourists. It's just like visiting Rome and Milan, for example, and going to like the places where normal citizens live. It's like unless you're an explorer, and even this number is a minority, and so there's no reason for the Romans to come to Capernaum or Nazareth or even Galilee. There are books that have been written that argues for that they come to Palestine, they come to Jerusalem. Sure, they come to Jerusalem every single year for the Passover festivals, and Jews from the diaspora would make their way to the temple, and so would their Roman brethren, their friends, and things like that, because all these people would frequent the temple as well. And we even have reports whereby even Romans would enter the synagogues in the diaspora and would listen to the stories of the Torah, because they found these stories amazing, and things like that. And Jews would, invite them in, and things like that. And the concept of Jews not wanting other people to become Jews is actually a modern concept. There is more evidence in the ancient world that actually Jews would want to give dawah, for example, or want to call people to their religion, especially the Roman pagans, for example. And we know about this because there's a lot of reports as well. And also, if we want to use the New Testament, we can argue this for the case, at least in the Corinthian correspondence. And so because we have Jews early on that goes to Rome and things like that, and they probably preach their message to the community, or they don't even preach the message to the community, but because the Romans would frequent the synagogues, they would be enlightened by the preachings and the recitation of the Torah, for example, and then they would want to become Jews themselves. And so the modern concept is cannot be established in the past, because in the past we have evidence whereby Jews would actually want people to become Jews, the Gentiles to become Jews. By the way, Gentiles means like non-Jews, and it includes Arab as well. And so how do we what is the evidence then that the New Testament have been interpreted in light of the Greco-Roman world, and Jesus has not preached, at least in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus has not preached, or at least the understanding of the authors of the Synoptic Gospel is that whereby Jesus did not, or they do not believe that Jesus preached the Gospels and interpreted in the way the Greco-Romans had interpreted them later on, mostly by the Church Fathers. And that is why we have the controversy, the Trinitarian controversy and the Christological controversy of the late 3rd, 4th, and 5th century of the Common Era. And so this is very difficult to establish for Trinitarian Christians then, to argue in a sense whereby Jesus actually preached their understanding, or at least the synoptic authors' understanding of what it means to preach about the message of God, for example. And even in John, if you read Raymond Brown's commentary, the 2-volume commentary on John, the Anchor Yale series, the primitive John portrays a Christology in a sense, or the belief about the nature of Jesus, much more closer to the synoptics, because the Gospel according to John have undergone through about 5 layers of editing, according to Raymond Brown. Modern theories are much different than that, because Raymond Brown wrote this 30-40 years ago, and so the modern commentaries have given a different understanding of this. But again, these are all hypotheses, and so either one could be plausible, or both of them could not be plausible as well. And how do we know? We don't know, because this is just hypothesis, but educated guesses, but anyway, and so the primitive author, or the editor, or the creator, the writer of the Gospel according to John probably had a view that is low in Christology and pretty much closer to the synoptics as well. And even in early Christian Apocrypha as well, we have this sort of low Christology as well. And so when Jesus mentioned the Son of Man, the Son of God, for example, mentioned by the authors, by the way, I'm a bit hesitant to say that Jesus mentioned this and that, because if you read the red letter Bible of the NKJV, these are all highlighted in red, the alleged speech of Jesus, but some of them are just blatantly wrong. For example, it's like you can literally see that this is actually Mark's commentary, like Mark's closing narrative in certain passages, and then it is read in letter, for example. And so this is absolutely wrong, and a lot of scholars have highlighted this as well, and a lot of people have highlighted this as well on the internet, and you can go check it out. But at least the synoptic authors portrays a low Christology, and so when Christians later on read them in light of high Christology, the Trinitarian concept, and again, this is even far-fetched from the early Greco-Roman understanding of the gospel, if you want to call it that, because all these are much later. The modern concept of reading scripture in light of the Trinitarian perspective can only go back to around the 4th and the 5th centuries, because if you start going back earlier on, you start to realize that it is more Jewish in their readings, for example. Because if you read the early writings of the Church Fathers, you can see that they are actually Jewish in their understanding, even though they're Goyim, they're Gentiles. And so it is only towards the 4th and 5th century whereby you have a lot of this argument about the nature of Jesus and things like that. And the reason why the argument started, and according to the Trinitarians, it is probably because Arius was actually portraying a different view of Jesus or the Son. But that is actually, if you read the text, that is actually not what it is, because Origen doesn't have a Trinitarian concept. Justin Martyr, the Logos master, the master of Logos theology, doesn't have a Trinitarian concept, and so mostly all of them is like Patripassianism, the Patripassianistic in a sense, whereby the Father suffers as well. They do not believe that when God becomes a Son, there is God and Son is separate, but it is at the same time they're co-equal, co-eternal, like they're three different beings in a sense. And so that is not the understanding of the early Church Fathers, for example, at least up to the time of Arius or even after that. Because if you read R.P.C. Hansen's work, as well as one more author, Louis something, they argue it this way. whereby Origen do not believe in the Trinity. It would be a complete lie to say that Origen believed in the Trinity. And the reason why a lot of these controversies actually kick off much later on was that because Arius mentions that we found none of our early predecessors believing in what later came to be Trinitarian concept. But even that is far-fetched. Athanasius wasn't a Trinitarian. Athanasius actually just argues anyhow. Yeah, if you really read what scholars wrote about Athanasius, Athanasius is the reason we have this problem, but he is not actually fluid in his arguments. He just argues anyhow, just to win a point. For example, it's just like you're debating with someone, and you know that they have not answered your questions and things like that, and so they just throw things at you, red herrings, and being polemical, and they just argue anyhow, just to win over people instead of actually addressing the point. And so that is what Athanasius actually does or did, according to scholars. And so when Christians read the New Testament today, especially the Gospels and the works of Paul are the two most read portions of the New Testament. For some reason, James, Jude, Revelation, Hebrews and the Old Testament, Leviticus, Numbers, Exodus, have not been read. Like the book of Isaiah and things like that. A lot of Christians mostly focus on Psalms, and they go to a specific Psalms. You know what I mean? And they just throw the Torah out of the window for some reason. And whereas the New Testament and Paul quotes hundreds of passages from the Old Testament, from the Hebrew Bible, hundreds of passages, and for some reason Christians do not go back to actually read these passages in the Old Testament and to actually read them in context, and also because if they read them in context, they'll realize that there's a lot of actually misinterpretation. The New Testament, the authors doesn't actually quote fully and doesn't quote successfully from the Old Testament. A lot of them, I would not say a lot of them, a portion of them actually misquoted and also gave a different sense of history, especially in Mark. And so again, the details is too broad. I have it recorded in my Bible that I use for studying over the years here. Maybe someday I'll show you the notes here, but it will take a long time. But yeah, anyway, and so it's very difficult to establish any sense of Trinity because there is no such passages in the New Testament and as well in the Old Testament. And I've heard a lot of works. I've heard a lot of debates. I've seen a lot of debates online whereby evangelical Christians try to prove a point in the Old Testament that the Jews don't even believe it to be interpreted that way. And sometimes there is no link between the two, like the Trinity, for example, because there is no passages and the concept itself cannot be established, and because historically it is recorded in the minutes at Nicaea, as well as the early writings of the Church Fathers, that all this came to be because of the Trinitarian controversy. And if you go back to the early writings without being anachronistic in your view or outtake, you start to realize that it is more Jewish in their concept, even though these authors might be Greco-Romans themselves. They're not necessarily Jews. They might be Gentiles, especially Matthew. A lot of people believe that Matthew was actually a Jew, but I believe Matthew was a Gentile. Matthew made a lot of mistakes when it comes to his understanding of the Hebrew Bible. For example, the colt and the donkey passages. Jesus was riding on two animals. And so this is a misunderstanding of Jewish dualism in Matthew's part, whoever he may be. And so Matthew is a good example, whereby I believe it was a Gentile author who tries to be Jewish in his view, at least in his writings that have been passed down to us. And so were the synoptic authors. And Luke has a very Jewish concept, in a sense, whereby there's no dying for the sins of humanity. Jesus did not die on the cross for the sins of humanity, like we found on Matthew and Mark, as well as in John, for example. And the death of Jesus, according to Luke, is so that people would turn. They will make tawbah. Again, the Hebrew term here is teshuva. They would turn from their old ways, and then they would, so that God can give them mercy, in a sense. And so we have a very different theology when it comes to the gospel authors themselves, even within the synoptics. But if you analyze all of this in a whole, a lot of scholars believe, critical scholars, that a lot of these early interpretations of the gospel, or at least the understanding of the synoptic authors, and even to that of Paul. I'll get to Paul in second, very briefly. I'll just finish off my point on the synoptic authors here and their view, or at least their theology, or their outtake about Jesus, is that they believe that Jesus is just like the Son of God, or the sons of God. God had sons by the tons in the Old Testament, and for some reason Christians, Trinitarian Christians, miss this, and they also use the point that Jesus is the Messiah, therefore he is part of the Trinity, for example. Even the word itself, the very phrase "part of the Trinity," it is like a portion of a whole thing, and so God is actually a portion and it's not one. And so the phrasing itself that they use is hugely flawed, and a lot of Christians, Trinitarian Christians, actually do not understand what the Trinity is. They don't even know the concept. When they say that God become the Son, they don't even know what they're talking about. And when you try to ask them to explain, what do you mean by God the Son? And so can we say that Son the God then, if it's Trinity? They will say, no, you can't, because it's three beings, but three beings that are co-equal, co-eternal, which defies logic in a sense. But Christians seems to be able to grasp this concept, or at least pretend to, and so I don't know about that one. But for me, I found the Trinitarian concept actually it defies logic, and I've been trying to understand it, and I just can't seem to understand. And so that's why I'm not a Christian, because I can't seem to fathom this idea about the Trinity. And historically as well, we do know its origin and where it comes from and the reason why it came to be. And we found no support for it whatsoever in the readings of the early authors, in their social context. We have no support for the Trinity whatsoever. The famous phrase in John, okay, whereby the doubting Thomas phrase, whereby my Lord and my God, proclaimed Thomas. That is actually a figure of speech. That is not Thomas saying that Jesus is my Lord and my God. That is actually a figure of speech, because Thomas wasn't there, and so Jesus called Thomas to touch his side and to feel the whatever he has gone through at the stake, at the cross. And so that's actually a figure of speech, like Thomas finally realized that this is actually Jesus. And so again, a lot of Christians have misunderstood, because they do not read it in the context of the of when these books were actually written. Because if they actually take the time to study the Greco-Roman world, and numerous books have been published on this, and although the books are very thick, and you do need to spend a lot of time to actually go through these books and to actually understand, fully understand the Greco-Roman world, because that is actually a very important endeavor that you can do for yourself. It will take you years. It will take you probably 2 years to focus just on the Greco-Roman world, to read the Greco-Roman literature, to read the early patristic writings, and to read them with an open mind, and not just be selective in your readings because it fits along your theology. No, you have to be fair to yourself. In your quest for knowledge, irregardless whatever beliefs you may have, you have to actually let the text speak for itself, in light of what other texts say about it. And you must read all of these texts in context. Hopefully that doesn't sound confusing. And so, ladies and gentlemen, Paul himself was actually writing in the early portions, or at least the middle portions of the first century of the Common Era. And if you read the similar writings to what Paul has, the authentic ones, 7 of them, you start to realize that Paul never portrays a concept of Trinitarianism. A lot of Christians would turn to Philippians chapter 2, the hymn of Christ, or the hymn to Christ. A lot of scholars believe that this is a much later interpolation, because it is just foreign to the other writings of Paul. And we found this, a lot of scholars agree on this when it comes to Philippians chapter 2, as well as John, the prologue of John as well. And so this is a much later interpolations, probably by the Pauline school, quote-unquote Pauline school. There were no actually Pauline school. We have no evidence for that, but probably the disciples of Paul, or the disciples of Paul, actually much later on brought upon this concept and edited letters to the Philippians. And so Paul is pretty much very Jewish, and the concept of a man God, like physical man God, like literally a man, a God manifested in a man, is actually foreign to Pharisees, foreign to Jews, even till today. And And so the Old Testament is very clear on this. And Paul quotes hundreds of times from the Old Testament, from the Torah, from the a lot of these. Today we call them prophetic books, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, Torah, for example. And that has been the way of the Masoretes as well. Personally, I do not know if that is actually how it has been divided. Probably not, because if you look at the Qumran scrolls, that doesn't seem to be the case, but I could be completely mistaken, so please correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, Paul quotes hundreds of passages from the Old Testament. And so Paul is well versed in the Old Testament, and he doesn't seem to portray any sort of like man-God theology, for example. And he doesn't view Jesus as God, for example. The very famous passage, the head of Christ is God. And so a lot of Christians would turn to Philippians chapter 2 instead of actually turning to what Paul actually was emphasizing. In Corinthians, Paul was actually emphasizing to the people, to his congregations. And so he was really being emphatic in his message. And so this is a clear-cut statement from Paul. But for some reason, the Trinitarian Christians have completely ignored this and instead turned to something ambiguous in Philippians chapter 2. But anyway, I digress. Ladies and gentlemen, there's one good book that I would like to recommend you. This could be the start to your study of the Greco-Roman world, but you do need to be able to read Greek. And this is Iesus Deus by M. David Latour. The early Christian depiction, of Jesus as a Mediterranean God, for example. This is a fantastic book. I have a quote here that I would like to read to you probably next time. I'm losing my voice here and this video is already too long, but this author is actually fair in his take. No, it is actually fair in his take, and this is published by Fortress Press, and so it is an academic work. And so in chapter 2, maybe I'll just tell you what chapter 2 is about. Chapter 2 is titled "From Where Was This Child Born?" And this is actually an answer. The answer is actually in chapter 1. The answer is not through semen, surely. I just found this funny. I don't know if the author intended it this way, but that is, I just found this. Maybe the author could have intended it this way. But so the moral of the story is, God cannot be born of a semen. That means he cannot be born of a woman. And Jesus was born of a woman. And so Jesus cannot be God. And so how can God be born even? To think about it is just actually puzzling. And the concept of God coming down to earth is not found in the New Testament. It is actually not found even in the Old Testament. If you actually read it in the context of when these books were actually published. So anyway, thank you for joining me once again. My name is Arfat. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.